welcome to Talking Ukrainian English, episode number 20. We're up to 20 episodes, and for this one, I thought I'd try something a little different and have more than one person on. So we have Professor Olis Motyl, who is the first episode we ever did for this podcast, and then we have Dr. Taras Kuzio, who was a couple episodes after that. So, gentlemen, welcome back.
Thank
It's
you
been
for inviting me.
Thank
And
you, thank you.
we're both surprised you invited us back after the last podcast, but there you are.
Yeah, well, I mean, you both had good things to talk about, and I think people were interested, and it's been a while, and I think enough has changed because we spoke, I think, before Trump. Well, we spoke before Trump was even elected. I think you and me, all this, and then Trump
hmm
had been elected to us, and when we had spoken, so but he hadn't been president yet, so there was a lot of speculation, and now we're is it four months in or so, and
Speculation and misplaced optimism, maybe.
misplaced optimism. Yeah, there's always this, people always holding out for this sort of like silver lining of like, well, what's he really gonna do? He says this and that, but what's he really gonna do? So I just thought maybe we'd just start with getting each of your sort of remarks on maybe where things are now. So I made this post the other day on my Facebook that Trump, the people are like, oh, now he finally said something bad about Putin. He's irritated by Putin. And again, people are like hoping that something will happen and he'll have a spine and actually like do something. And I
No,
sort of,
no, he's Taco, remember? Taco.
yeah, well, I sort of have this feeling that there's a different game being played, and he's beholden to the Russians in some way, and so he's just dragging things out. Um, he knows what's a little more than what's going on, and then this sort of like naivete that's been playing out, I think, in the public arena. So I wanted to we can start there, maybe get your take on the most recent events and whether you agree with that, or because in every instance when Trump is opposed, he lashes out and goes on the attack. That's what he's been trained to do, by his experiences in the past. It's like if someone opposes Trump, he'll sue them, he'll take them to court. He reacts like pretty aggressively, and I think that's one thing that people who supported him like about him, that he sort of like does that. But in this case, he just lets Putin do whatever he wants. So my thought is that he's not that naive, but there's something else going on. So I don't know, maybe Alice, let's start with you. Just what's your take on sort of like the most recent events and where we are today, and then we'll hear from Taras about the same question, and then let's have a dialogue.
Well, my own sense is that Trump has painted himself into a corner, and he did it by appropriating the war. When he declared back in, I think it was October of last year, that he was going to resolve the war, bring peace to the war in 24 hours, that effectively meant that he was taking ownership of the war. And if you look at his statements and the statements by Rubio and others in the last few weeks, they are feverishly claiming that, oh no, this is Biden's war. We had nothing to do with it. And I suspect what that really means is that they're getting nervous because they know that this is now their war. And the option of simply cutting and running is no longer on the table. I mean, they invoke it all the time. They have to because it's part of their negotiating tactics. But you can't just cut and run because this would then transform. Then the war would translate into his version of Biden's Afghanistan. He would look weak. He would look like a coward. That is to say, Trump would look weak and would look like a coward. So effectively, he's boxed himself into a corner where he needs to do something. And at that point, we're up against this question of what is it exactly that's driving him toward being so soft on Putin. One, as you all know, there are a bunch of arguments made. One that is perfectly plausible, although it's probably the most fantastic, is that he's a Russian asset, that he was somehow or other pressured into serving the Russian cause in 1987, possibly thereafter, may have something to do with a honeypot, more likely than not. Had something to do with his laundering money for oligarchs, perhaps his bribes, the bribes he had to pay in order to get something done in Moscow. But in any case, if you adopt that point of view, his entire behavior sounds perfectly reasonable. You would expect exactly this kind of behavior, these kinds of policies from a Russian asset. And note that just 2 days ago in a press conference, he said, if it weren't for me, conditions for Russia would be much worse. And that was essentially his admission of the fact that he's been purposefully, consciously being soft on Russia. It's not just some kind of tactic, it's more than that. It seems to be a reflection of his being a potential asset. But that's just one possibility. The other possibility, which is perfectly plausible and would explain a great deal, is the fact that he's ignorant. Witkoff is ignorant. Rubio is less so, but Hegseth, Witkoff, less so Kellogg, but certainly the president is ignorant. He doesn't read his intelligence reports. He seems to get his news from his sons or from Fox News. He knows nothing about Russia. He knows nothing about Ukraine. He knows nothing about the war, as do his colleagues, his minions. And in that sense, again, he may have these completely delusional notions of what's going on. He may have completely delusional notions of what Putin is and is not. And that would explain a lot. Last but not least, and well, maybe not, well, at least the last that comes to mind, is the fact that he genuinely admires Putin. He admires the political system he's built. He's trying to construct something very similar in the United States, essentially a fascist system. If that makes people uncomfortable, then call it a tyranny, call it a dictatorship, call it a semi-consolidated authoritarian system. But whatever it is certainly anti-democratic. We know that that Trump admires Putin, thinks of him as his idol. He has similar feelings about Orban and other right-wing extremist leaders in Europe and other places of the world. And in that sense, I mean, his decision to play nice, to make nice with Putin, may simply be a function of the fact that he genuinely, truly likes and admires the guy. Witkoff said that outright about his own feelings toward Putin, so it's perfectly plausible that these feelings are also held by Trump. Final point is this. These three explanations don't cancel each other out. It's perfectly possible that he admires Putin. It's perfectly possible that he's ignorant. And it's perfectly possible that Trump is some kind of asset. And he could be all three of these things simultaneously. My own inclination is to suggest that that's probably the case. If the shoe fits three times, if you have 3 feet to fit the shoe, so to speak, then hey, that must be the explanation that holds most water.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that probably all those things that you're mentioning have some truth to it. And for me, it's weird that the media isn't challenging him more on that, and everyone's just sort of like going along with this show. Um, Tadas, what do you think? I mean, is this like a show that Trump's putting on? Is he just ignorant? What are your thoughts from
Well, the first
England?
thing that, and I'm sure Alex here agrees, is that I sometimes joke when I'm asked this question in lectures, is that sadly, political scientists sometimes have to be psychologists. And trying to figure people like Trump out is more in the realm of psychology than in political science, because he's actually very irrational often at the time. Because he could have resolved this conflict or come across as trying to resolve this conflict if he'd approached it very differently. But, if the Wall Street Journal is already accusing him of being a taco, as somebody who always chickens out, then Trump has a problem. This is not the New York Times saying this. This is the Wall Street Journal, and this is a newspaper I subscribe to, and the editorials have been scathing of Trump's weakness vis-a-vis Russia. So Trump is actually often irrational, and therefore, you know, I love it when the sort of more European British political science kind of pokes at the American political scientists because they think that with rational choice and everything they can figure all these things out. And I and I would like to see how you can figure out somebody like Trump. I don't think that he's an asset. I think he's a useful idiot, yes, but that's because um, I mean, if he was a real Russian asset, firstly, he wouldn't be acting in such a way. He'd be acting as actually more anti-Russian. Um, and secondly, I think that the um, the idea that somehow the Kremlin has some compromat on Trump is actually a bit naive because I mean Trump is a Teflon president. I mean, the guy has so many criminal charges against him. You know, he's got, you know, he's a pedophile, a rapist, criminal charges to the hilt, the most bankrupted guy in America, and yet people still vote for him. So, you know, he's talked about women in such a derogatory manner. Women still vote for him in the US. So, I
No
mean,
one would be fazed by this compromat,
no,
basically. Yeah.
exactly. I mean, what other compromat? I mean, the guy's blatantly corrupt.
Yeah.
So tell me what kind of compromat could Putin have on him? I mean, I'd love to see it because he's openly all of these things, and yet, you know, people vote for him, and they don't just vote for him because it's Trump. I mean, there's you know there've been very good analysis like recently in Foreign Policy magazine where a lot of this is Biden's fault for Trump being elected. You know, Biden must have known that he had cancer last year. Why did he hang on so long? And then be forced to leave the political scene and promote his vice president as a candidate who could never be elected. I mean, she's got three things against her. She's from California, she's a lady of color, and she's a woman. I mean, that simply makes her impossible to be elected in the
Ag-
US
Against Trump, anyway. I think that that's,
against
yeah.
Trump. Yes, exactly. So I mean, you know, let's not rule out that. Just like in the case of Britain with the Brexit referendum, this was Prime Minister Cameron's fault. He assumed that Britons wouldn't be so stupid as to vote for Brexit. Well, they did, and they allowed a very low bar of 50% as opposed to 65%, which it should have been a constitutional referendum. What is driving him? I think there are things there which I'm sure Alex agrees with. Things like he's got a disdain for small countries. He likes this world of the big macho powers, you know, Russia, China, America having these spheres of influence. So he likes that idea. He would actually be very willing to agree to Putin's wet dream, which is a second Yalta, you know, where the US and Russia sit down and just carve up the world, or at least carve up Europe and Eurasia. So I think that's probably one thing that's driving him. I think he has a personal antagonism against Zelensky, of course, because he blames him for his first impeachment. Um, so I think he's got that realism issue there. The ignorance, there's no question. I mean, he brags that he doesn't read books. I mean, he I think from what I understand, he doesn't read more than half a page of his executive briefs each day. I remember one during the first Trump presidency where every morning at 9:30 he gets the intelligence briefs, and about 9:32 or 9:33 he's tweeting complaining about a US department store not stocking his daughter's handbags. So that was more important to him than the intelligence briefs that he got at 9:30. So the ignorance aspect is there. I mean, and as for Witkoff, I think there's an interesting aspect here that he comes from this Russian Jewish background. And I've always been intrigued during this full-scale war with Russia, why Israel is not militarily in an alliance with Ukraine. Israel and Ukraine have the same existential problem. Iran wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Russia wants to wipe Ukraine off the face of the earth. Iran and Russia have a military alliance. So it's rational for Israel and Ukraine to have a military alliance. There isn't one because Netanyahu is a big buddy of Putin. Why is he a big buddy of Putin? There are many reasons, but one of them is that the Russian Jews who are living in Israel and who are a major constituency of the far right in Israeli politics, which Netanyahu relies upon, are pro-Putin. They're pro the Putin regime. They watch Russian TV all day, and Witkoff is from that same milieu, same kind of, Russophile, Putinophile kind of milieu as these Russian Jewish voters for Netanyahu and the far right in Israel. So I think that's another angle to all of this. I think another aspect is that, which again is kind of irrational, because Trump seems to be really concerned about ending the bloodshed, ending the war. But at the same time, he doesn't really give a damn about Ukrainian casualties. And he just said a few days ago that, oh, Putin must be crazy. What's he doing? Well, Putin hasn't just now started killing Ukrainian civilians. He's been doing it from day one of the full-scale invasion, if you want to go back to as far back as 2014. So, Trump, wake up, guy. I mean, this is nothing relatively new. So I think all of those factors are there. To be ignorant when you have, is it 17 or 18 intelligence agencies in the US, and to have, Washington, you trip over think tanks in Washington. Great publications like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy. There's no excuse to be ignorant. You're ignorant because you want to be ignorant, or you are so narcissistic that you think you know everything already. So I think there's that. Finally, just a final factor. The terrible meeting in the Oval Office between Zelensky and Trump and Vance. I mean, obviously, I was angry very much with Trump and Vance for this, but Zelensky was also at fault here. Where was his interpreter? His English isn't good enough to conduct this kind of negotiation live for the cameras. He needed, I mean, Macron, for example, took an interpreter. An interpreter means you've got time to try to understand the nuances and take time to reply. So, and a lot of Ukrainians advised Zelensky not to go to that meeting because it was a disaster. It was a disaster waiting to happen, as it were. So there's a Ukrainian angle to this as well, I think, which we should talk about as well. But all of those factors are there. So I think um, trying to get our heads around Trump is extremely complicated because Alex is right. He's painted himself into a corner here. He if He can't really walk away because then it's an embarrassment. I mean, he looks very weak. He's already been called taco. But at the same time, he doesn't want to be tough on Putin, and he keeps extending these deadlines for Putin. And I mean, it must be obvious to everybody. I mean, including U.S. senators and including Republicans. Lindsey Graham has just arrived in Kiev. That the Russians, the Kremlin's laughing their heads off at Trump. I mean, they're laughing all the way. I mean, I watch Russian TV on X, on Twitter, and they're just laughing at Trump. They don't take him seriously. Um, how can you not take this into account? And the only way to, surely we all understand, the only way to approach Putin is by adopting a strong position. If you come across to Putin as weak, he's going to never take you seriously. I mean, he'll only take you seriously if you approach him with a baseball bat. So I think all of those factors would be the ones I would line up um, front and face. But I would love to hear what Alex thinks of many of these different points, particularly the Witkoff Russian Jewish Brighton Beach kind of Israeli, um, because Witkoff just came across as a complete. If you think Trump's an idiot, Witkoff came even across even worse in the interview with Tucker Carlson.
I mean, you made all sorts of excellent points, and I find myself in complete agreement. So I won't waste time repeating the points that you made, except that I'd like to underline one of the points that you alluded to but didn't quite pursue, namely Trump's narcissism
Yeah,
and
yes,
his belief. And it's not just that he's a narcissist. I mean, that would be bad enough, but okay, most presidents probably are to some degree. It's part of the job description. But it's the fact that he truly believes that he is God's envoy on earth.
hmm
He truly believes that he's a genius. I mean, he said that so many times.
hmm
He's a genius, he's God-given. And of course, last but not least, he's a narcissist. And why read? Why take advice from people who might know things if you know things in advance? I mean, he is omniscient. I mean, that's the definition of a God-given genius. He has it in his fingers. He has it in his blood.
Yeah.
He knows best. And in
Mhm.
that sense, the criticism, again, it's a valid criticism that you and I and others make that he's ignorant and so on. But the bottom line is he would simply respond to that by saying, but I know anyway. I know better
You're
than
right.
you guys because of who I am.
Yeah. And, and
There you
and that
go.
was seen in that famous press conference in Helsinki where he said he trusted, he didn't believe the US intelligence services. He was more trustworthy of what Putin told him and what he
Mm,
himself knew.
I
that's right.
I think he has some financial incentive in regards to Russia. Like all his decisions seem to underliningly like his goal is to make some money. Even as president, he's
Yeah,
got all
yeah.
these side businesses and side deals going. And whether it's been like laundering money for Russians, like you mentioned, Alex, like over the years, or trying to build some real estate in Moscow, or maybe some potential deals. He's talking about how once the war is settled, there's economic boon to be had with Russia. I think there's like some financial incentive that's also like at play here in sort of like the way
Sure, sure,
he acts towards Putin.
I
sure,
get
sure.
that may be more a function of his ignorance than anything else. Again, let me do the usual disclaimer. I am not an economist, but I'll talk about the economy anyway. But the person I like reading about the condition of the Russian economy is Jeffrey Sonnenfeld. He's a Yale University professor who follows very closely the developments within the Russian economy. And more importantly, he has direct contacts with several hundred CEOs of American corporations that were formerly in Russia and are now out of Russia. And based on what he says, it's pretty clear that there's almost no incentive to go back into Russia. Um, what would you do there? I mean, it's a poor country with atomic weapons, no rule of law, bribes, be paying bribes galore on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. The only thing that the Russians export is energy, which is now no longer quite as necessary as it used to be 3, 4 years ago. So what's the incentive? What's the big money that you could make in Russia? I'm not at all sure what that is. In contrast, I mean, look at Trump's recent trip to the Middle East, $150 billion that the Saudis claim to invest. He gets a plane from Qatar. His sons feel out the terrain just before he arrived and signed all sorts of deals. That's where the big money is, not in
Yeah, yeah.
Russia.
Trump's bringing peace to the Middle East by signing arms deals. I mean, that's a new deal breaker, I suppose. I agree with you completely because the U.S.-Russian trade, even before the full-scale invasion of 22, was minuscule. I mean, it was very small, especially compared to Europe. What the Germans and others were doing in Russia. So, I mean, unless he's just got a got a kind of a wet dream about having a taco Trump Tower in Moscow, maybe. I mean, which is apparently the books that do claim he's an agent say that this is one of the things he was always after from the late 1980s. But beyond that, you're right. I mean, especially because the US has far tougher legislation than many European countries about US
hmm
companies abroad not accepting bribes. I forget the particular legislation, what it's called, but Firtash was criminally charged by the US for this in 2014, the Ukrainian gas tycoon because he gave bribes in India through an American company, I think. So the US, so you're right. I mean, it's impossible even if the US company went back to Russia, that company would be impossible to operate in Russia without corruption. So, which again would open that company up to, you know, huge criminal charges in the US. I mean, the US is in that sense stricter than European countries. Plus, I think the other factor which hasn't been mentioned is that if you had to choose between China and Russia, I mean, you're gonna make a lot more money in China than you are in Russia, uh, um, and
Exactly.
and and a lot of European countries are doing that. I mean, Germany, for example, and others. So so yeah, I mean that I'm not so sure about the financial side. I mean, Damien, what you're referring to, I think, is that Deutsche Bank um, was the only Western bank willing to offer loans to the Trump empire because I think Trump is the most bankrupted businessman in American history. Um, and um, and Deutsche Bank got a lot of that money from Russia. I think that was
Well,
one of the
there's also that he had, I think, a lot of Russians buying apartments in his
no,
building,
sure,
things
sure.
like that.
Even
And
Mogilevich, I think,
yeah, and
bought a condo. So it's the Brighton Beach kind of. But I mean, there's loose money and corrupt money in every construction business in every country, including Britain. US isn't unique here, with Italians and Brighton Beach. I
well,
mean, that's true everywhere.
I mean, I just think he's been used to dealing with this Russian elite where wealth is concentrated, and that's
Sure,
all he
sure,
cares about.
sure, sure,
And
sure.
maybe he owes them money because they bankrupted him, or they bailed him out from bankruptcy, or maybe they're promising him some sort of deals, and he's sort of ignorant about like all these things that you're saying that actually could be hurdles in reality of it. But
But I
it's
think
yeah.
I think Alex made a very good point here that what we call ignorant is actually something that Trump would just brush aside. If you're a narcissist and you know everything anyway, why do you need to read books? Why do you need to read executive briefs? Tiv says Nyash. I mean, um, you know. So I think Trump's like that. I mean, and sadly, he's come across, including Witkoff as well, and Vance as also, as completely ignorant of what the Kremlin calls the root causes of the war in
hmm
Ukraine. Rubio is, I think, a
Yeah.
separate issue because I think that's another factor that we haven't talked about is that how the Republicans like Rubio and Republican senators and congressmen and women have just become sycophants. They're just
hmm
unwilling to challenge him, and even though they can see Lindsey Graham is not stupid. You can see that the Kremlin is laughing its head off at Trump, of how weak he is. So I think that that's another aspect that Trump has complete control of the Republican Party. I listened to a podcast today where one of the questions was, "What the hell's happened to Pence?" Well, the
hmm
Republican Party that Pence loves has gone. right? And we have a Republican Party controlled by Trump, which doesn't allow any dissent. Um, and so there's nobody standing up and saying, Donald, I think you look like an idiot. Come on, this is, you look really weak. I mean, it's time to be tough to Putin. Nobody's saying that to him. Um, the even though the senators have what a massive majority, Democrats and Republicans, for these very tough sanctions, they're waiting for the green light from the White House.
And quite the contrary. I mean, his minions are use every opportunity to praise him. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
it's reminiscent of Soviet behavior vis-a-vis Brezhnev, Mao
yeah.
Zedong, and others. I mean, it's striking how similar we've become, the United States, to some of these totalitarian autocracies.
I wonder whether there are going to be as many jokes about Trump as there were Brezhnev jokes. Remember those in the in the 70s and 80s? There were books. This is before your time, Damien, but there were books about, so many jokes from that era. And maybe the same thing's happening, that these Republicans are doing jokes about Trump in the kitchen.
Well, one of the things about the Republicans that may be hopeful is that, within a year and a half, there will be the midterm elections.
Right.
And many of them will be, again, caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, their loyalty to Trump will demand that they support every one of his policy initiatives. On the other hand, those policy initiatives are very likely to do enormous harm to their constituents. So it's either you support Trump and lose, or you don't support Trump and win, but also lose. I'm not sure how this, I'm not sure what they're going to, how they're going to resolve this particular dilemma, but
Yeah.
it will certainly lead to some losses and to some defections.
That assumes the Democratic Party gets his act together.
It also assumes that the elections will take place.
I mean, this irrationality can be even applied to somebody who's an incredibly good businessman, Elon Musk. I mean, did he not realize that Trump supporters drive pickup trucks and not e-cars? Uh, and so inevitably hipsters who drive e-cars and don't vote for Trump are going to be not very happy that he's now in bed with Trump. So, this irrationality is not just Trump here. I mean, it's a bit of a broader thing. I guess we're at the stage, and I'd love to hear Alex about this. Is Trump going to be tough on Putin? Is he going to finally give the green light to the senators to go ahead with these, very tough sanctions? And what do you think, Alex?
$64,000 question.
Yeah, I know, I know, I
Uh,
know.
I mean, if I had to bet on his doing so, I'd bet $20. That would be reflective of the fact that I have lingering hopes, but
Well,
no
that's like one
particular.
beer in Manhattan, right? So,
That's pretty, yeah, exactly. Uh, You know, uh, Given his track record, there's absolutely no reason to expect him to change it suddenly.
right.
And of course, we've also talked about all the reasons, both personal, political, and so on, that incline him in this particular direction. On the other hand, and of course, as you know, these are the arguments that Phillips O'Brien has been making consistently for the
Right,
last
right,
few
right.
months. I think O'Brien is right, but perhaps not completely right. And I only base this on my hopes rather than on any kind of theoretical expectations. It seems to me that it is possible for Trump to change his mind. Again, Taco is, of course, an indication of that. He adopts fantastic positions, ignorant positions, and then very often backtracks. Not always. Sometimes he just intensifies his attacks. But he has been known to backtrack, and he has backtracked in the last few weeks, which suggests to me that it's not impossible
Right.
Again, notice I'm using a double negative, which is reflective of my own uncertainty. It's not impossible for him to change his mind vis-a-vis Putin. Perhaps not whole hog, perhaps not as much as we would like him to, but perhaps a continuation of some degree of support for Ukraine, which he can always trumpet as being absolutely critical, blah, blah, blah. Perhaps imposing another sanction or two. I mean, the ultimate test would be what he's going to do with this senatorial initiative.
Right.
Uh, because at this point, it's 82 senators, which means that it's at least 40, what is it, 49 Democrats and 53 Republicans. Uh, so certainly a significant portion, two-thirds of the Republican senators are on board. So clearly he's aware of this. He must be at least to some degree aware of the fact that if he cuts and run, his own infallible image will be harmed, if not
Right.
in his own eyes, at least in the eyes of other people. And one hopes that some of his minions will have some of the courage to say, "Hey, chief, you gotta do something, otherwise we're in deep doo-doo."
Yeah.
Now, again, as I said, I'd bet that this scenario will I'll bet $20 on this scenario.
Yeah.
Maybe if you press me against the wall, I'd go as far as to say 100. But that's still 5 beers,
Yeah.
right? Uh, I don't think it's quite as impossible as O'Brien thinks it is. But neither do I have any illusions about the likelihood that this is going to transpire with a big bang. If
Yeah.
anything, it's likely to be more of a whimper.
Right.
To me, there seems to be a disconnect between like the intelligence he should be getting in regards to Putin's goals and intentions. And I keep reading about how the Russian economy has totally pivoted towards this Russian war economy. And like Putin can't stop the war because it would mean a collapse of the Russian economy. Right now, the war is what's fueling the Russian economy, and I don't see that. I read about that, but I don't see that in the dialogue when Trump is talking. And so there's like this disconnect. Well, like Putin wants peace. He want like Putin obviously doesn't want peace, and he can't stop the war. I mean, it would be the end of his power in a lot of ways because it would be a failure, even if it just froze things as they are. So like, I don't know.
I,
Like, I mean, he must be getting these intelligence reports, or someone must be like
he's not reading
aware of
them.
this, right?
He's only getting to halfway down the page before he begins to ponder about handbags and department. Um, I mean, the one way to answer this is to say, well, actually, Trump won was tougher than Obama on Putin. But that maybe that Trump has long gone. And let's not forget that Obama, I mean, if you talk to people from Ukraine, they have a very negative view of Obama. It's not just Trump. And in many ways, more negative on Obama than on Trump, actually. Trump won, not Trump too. Um, so because Trump at least didn't veto weapons supplies. I mean, they were tough on Crimea than Obama. Obama was pretty weak on both Ukraine and Syria, by the way. It wasn't just Ukraine.
Hmm.
But I think Damien, you're right, because I think there's quite a few scholars now, experts writing about uh, Putin saying that he can't stop the war. And I don't think this factor comes anywhere, it doesn't even enter the Oval Office or the White House. And it's not just about the economy, it's more to do with the fear of what these veterans are going to do
Hmm.
when the war ends. I mean, um, and the reference point is the 1990s with the so-called Afghansi, because the Afghansi were a major part of the uh, criminal wildness of the 1990s in Russia. They were the hitmen and the for organized crime. I mean, they came back. They had no jobs. they turn to drugs and drink, and they literally became the hitmen of the wild east of the 1990s in Russia. And the fear today, where you have even more veterans of the war, that you could have a Prigozhin mutiny stroke two, or something similar. I mean, how do you deal with all of this? And I think they are very worried about this, and one of the this is one of the reasons the Putin clique is trying to bring these veterans, give them jobs, give them positions in government, in parliament, and such like. But there's too many of them. I mean, we're already approaching 1 million casualties, so there's going to be millions of potential veterans. But another factor why Putin can't stop the war is that he is a bit like Trump in the sense that he thinks he was brought into the world by God. Um, and so you have two people, Trump and Putin, both think that they were brought onto this earth by God for particular missions. There are books, banners and posters, websites, including by the Russian Military Historical Society and others, which portray Putin as the latest in a long line of tough, Russian leaders. So it's, Alexander, Nevsky, then Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Catherine, Stalin, and Putin. And Putin sees himself going into history as a gatherer of Russian lands. By Russian lands here, meaning uh, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. And he actually believes all of this. And there's a whole industry in Russia promoting this kind of mythology. So he cannot really backtrack from this. Plus, he's had to expand the raison d'etre for the war as not just dealing with these pesky Ukrainian Nazis, but also taking on the West, which of course has led to this alliance with Iran, North Korea, and China. So Putin can't really retreat, and I think he would be very afraid of retreating because there's no honor amongst thieves. I mean, there is a reason for these very long tables that Putin has negotiations. So I think Putin, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult. And I think that one of the major disappointments about Europeans in particular is, and the Biden administration, is that they never really dealt with this question of what is the goal of the war. And this is one valid criticism by the Trump administration of the Biden team. Because if the whole purpose of this supplying of weapons to Ukraine is just to allow Ukraine to continue fighting, that's not good for Ukraine, because Ukraine will be slowly destroyed. What we need is a goal of Russia's military defeat. And you only really have, it's only really the Brits, the Scandinavians, maybe the Poles and the Balts who are saying this. The others, the Germans, the French, the Americans, have never really come out and said that we want Russia's defeat. But that is what this really requires, because I don't see Putin backtracking here. I don't see Putin saying, "Okay, I'm out of here. We've had enough." I just don't see that. I mean, I think Alex is probably going to agree with that, but
No, I agree with you completely. I would only add one more element that complicates things. And in that sense, Putin has also painted himself into a corner. And that's the fact that officially Russia annexed those four oblasts. I'm not including the Crimea, which was annexed back in 2014.
Mhm.
So technically, from their point of view, it's Ukraine that is currently occupying Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and Donetsk. And it's not the Russians who are engaged in aggression. It's actually they are simply they are simply trying to retrieve the territories that they formerly annexed. Anyway, why that matters is that if Putin, I mean, as Trump and others have suggested, why don't we just simply call for a ceasefire or a peace along the current line of confrontation. That would mean formally agreeing not to liberate the territories that Russia has formally annexed. Putin can't do that, not with 1 million casualties. He needs to be able to say, I mean, he needs to be able to say that he's won something.
Right.
And if he hadn't annexed these territories, he could simply have said, well, we expanded control over Kherson and Zaporizhia. We got a little bit more of Donetsk and Luhansk. That's a victory. Hurrah. Let's all go home and get drunk.
Hmm.
But now he's set himself a bar which he cannot avoid,
Hmm.
which he cannot ignore. And I'm not sure at all that they will be able to conquer these territories anytime soon. But in any case, it's a barrier to Putin's doing just about anything. He needs to
Right.
stay in power. And again, when you add to that the 2 or 3 factors that both of you mentioned, then you have it's almost overdetermined, his inability and unwillingness to agree to any kind of lasting, just peace. My own conclusion from this is that Putin needs to go.
Yeah.
Or to put it differently, as long as he's around, there will be no peace. If and when he goes, there will at least be the opportunity for. There will still be various obstacles, including Russian political culture, the ideology, blah, blah. But at least there will be an opportunity for someone, perhaps within the so-called soft lining, semi-opposition, or perhaps even within the hardliner group, to come up with some alternative solutions to this conflict. But
Hmm.
as long as he's around, I just don't see anything happening.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, Damien, you probably also kind of, I mean, this war is it's not when Trump says this is Biden's war. No, this is Putin's war, and I don't see how he can retreat from it. And he as long as Putin's in power in Russia, I think the war will continue in whatever way.
I wonder if, I mean, Trump also believes in this, myth of Putin as the great capturer of Russian lands, and he respects that. And, he doesn't like Zelensky, he doesn't like Ukrainians, he doesn't give a shit what happens to Ukraine or what the terms of any sort of ceasefire are. He just wants it to happen and move on. And maybe he's even talked to Putin and said, like, yeah, I'll drag this out, like you put everything you can to get those territories, and I'll try to drag this out as long as I can. Like, this is what, I'm thinking that they're sort of like, I don't know, like working together to try to achieve Putin's aims. I mean, it's pretty conspirational, but like, it,
Damien, you've been talking to too many Ukrainians. You seem to love conspiracy theories,
but
or you're
it
just a
seems
big fan of the X-Files.
it seems
X-Files.
looking at his actions, that's what he seems to be doing, like let's like drag this out so Ukraine loses its weaponry that it has to defend itself. It goes through its storage, it goes through its Patriot missiles, and Russia is slowly taking territory, and
But
like
it's not though. I mean, the I was listening to again a really good. I think it's a CSIS, this Washington think tank podcast today, and if you look at all the different categories of how you define success, Russia's not been
well, they're
successful.
they're preparing for a summer surge. I've been
Yeah,
reading
but they've
now.
done this every year and it's never worked. And I saw a video on Twitter today of a Russian soldier on a bloody donkey, for Christ's sake. I mean, this is how pathetic is this so-called second. Russia's supposed to be a great power and it's going with a begging bowl to North Korea and Iran for weapons.
Hmm.
And let's put this into context. Russia is not. Uh, if Ukraine can hold, if I'm in many ways, I'm not even that worried that the US turns away because I think Ukraine with the Europeans um, can still hold back Russia from everything
Hmm.
I'm reading. And now with Ukraine producing about 50%, and that's likely to go up with all these various deals with Germany and elsewhere. Ukraine's producing 50% of the weapons it uses in Ukraine inside Ukraine. I think you know, I don't see how Russia can be really successful in terms of like a major breakthrough. Going back to your how Trump sees Russia, I think he actually sees Russia as the USSR, as this mighty, this mythical mighty country, and he hasn't got a clue that this is not the USSR,
Mm,
and this is basically a mafia broken state. U.S. diplomats, if you look on WikiLeaks, you can find it, as far back as 2010, described Russia as a mafia state. Um,
mhm,
so that's 15 years ago. But Trump has this kind of idea that the USSR still exists. It's Russia. He kind of still believes that kind of nonsense, and that Ukraine therefore has no cards. Ukraine has no chance of fighting against Russia. He because he's never really gone deeply into the whole the manner in which Ukraine has been actually very successful in fighting against Russia. And if it wasn't for the Biden administration's weakness in late 2022, Ukraine could have defeated Russia then, when
mhm,
Russia only had 170,000 troops inside Ukraine. And when, just after the Kharkiv offensive, if then the Biden administration had given Ukraine everything it wanted, Russia would have been defeated inside Ukraine. So, but I don't think Trump can get his head around that kind of idea because he's got this very kind of mythical idea that China, Russia, stroke USSR, and America are the big players, and everybody else should just basically kiss the ring.
mm. I think what you said is very important because one of the things that
Occasionally that
just
happens.
more than occasionally, Taras, but one of the things that just drives me crazy is reading all of these analyses that say Russia's winning, Russia's definitely going to win, they can't possibly lose. And it's the Kremlin narrative
Yeah.
in with Western language. Now, again, I don't want to overstate the degree to which Ukraine is doing well, but by virtually any measure of victory or defeat, Ukraine is actually on the victorious side.
Mhm.
Maybe only marginally so, but it's certainly not losing, certainly not in the sense that many of these people insist it is. And as you said, when you look at the Russian side, the economy is tanking. The military has been proven to be incompetent at best. The million casualties that they are soon about to suffer is alone testimony to the fact that something isn't quite right with the Russian military machine. And then when you consider that its closest allies are now North Korea, among its closest allies is North Korea. I mean, that alone should, signal something to people. I mean, China, I understand, but essentially Russia's relationship with China is that of a vassal state. I mean, it's
Yeah.
clearly China that runs the show. And none of these factors suggest that Russia is doing well. And even further, this notion that Putin is somehow a genius, a grandmaster at chess, and everybody else is playing checkers. Um, the guy, I mean, this is a point you've made on a number of occasions. I mean, the guy just doesn't get Ukraine. I
No.
mean,
No.
he doesn't get many things, but he certainly doesn't get Ukraine. And a reasonable, rational Putin would never have attacked in February of 2022. I mean, if he were simply guided by rationality and things like that. But clearly, the ideology, the culture, his own background, his training got in the way. Um, but when you look at these things sort of, from a certain distance, it's clear to me that Russia is hardly doing well. Ukraine is certainly hanging in there. And at worst, the outcome is a toss-up.
Hmm.
At present, it's something like a stalemate. But when you consider that Ukraine is by far the weaker country, a stalemate is a victory.
Hmm.
Imagine if the United States invaded Mexico and was close to capturing Mexico City and then was thrown back. And of the territory that it captured, it lost 50%. And now there's a stalemate just south of the Rio Grande River. people would be dancing in the streets in Mexico. This would qualify as an enormous victory.
Hmm.
And no one would be talking about an American victory, not under those sorts of
Hmm.
circumstances. So one of the things we do, and you do, and Damian does, and I try to do, we need to change that particular narrative, or at least add some question marks to it to get people to think as to why it seems to them that it's a slam dunk that Russia is going to win.
Well, I mean, I think it's better than it was. I mean, back in early 22, um,
Oh, yes.
I mean, it was terrible. I mean, it was like all every Western government. I mean, Boris Johnson claims he was the only British politician who didn't believe this. I mean, I don't know whether that's true or not, but with Boris, you never know. But certainly every Western government, all the Pentagon, the so-called Beltway bandits like the Rand Corporation and others were all predicting the same thing as the Kremlin. Ukraine would last three or 4 days and would be defeated. I mean, people like Alex and myself and others who were saying that's not true were in a minority.
Hmm.
Now those same people like Michael Kaufman are now the big experts on Ukraine, but only a few days before the 24th of February 22, he wrote in the Foreign Affairs that Ukraine's finished. I mean, that's it. It's going to be defeated very quickly. Um, but so I think that narrative has changed. It's now called, Ukrainian resilience, which we all know from growing up with Ukrainian parents. It's Ukrainian stubbornness, Ukrainian, it's Ukrainian um, experience of having to live next to, unpleasant neighbors, historically. Going back to Putin, yeah, I've joked on many occasions in talks that there are far more experts on Ukraine in Poland, in Britain, in the US and Canada than in Russia. There are no experts on Ukraine in Moscow and Russia. They think they know Ukraine, but of course they do not, because there's only what I could never understand at the beginning of the invasion was there was only 170,000 troops. Well, I'm sorry, but 170,000 troops for Ukraine shows you either didn't understand the country or you thought that these so-called little Russians would just be greeting you with bread and salt. Just to compare, 1968 Czechoslovakia, the Warsaw Pact invaded with 250,000 troops, a
Hmm.
country of 10 million. And here you have 45 million country of Ukraine invaded by 170,000. They obviously didn't figure out that these so-called little Russians or Russian-speaking Ukrainians are going to be not greeting them with bread and salt, but greeting them with stingers and javelins. They couldn't the very idea they couldn't get out of their heads. And I think this goes back to a more political science understanding that in a dictatorship like Russia, nobody's going to bring the dictator bad news.
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, because if you do, you get served some very dodgy tea, or you fall out of a window, right? So everybody brings information to the dictator what he wants to hear, and he wanted to hear that the little Russians are waiting to be liberated. You know, irrespective of whether that's true or not, and they
I
found out it
I
wasn't
think they
true.
believe their own propaganda that all these
Yeah,
Russian speaking Ukrainians,
yeah,
Russian speakers in Ukraine were pro-Russian
exactly.
or
Um,
defaulted to Russia and
I'll give you an example. I was just in Ukraine about about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I was in Kharkiv as well, and I met um, I won't mention their names. I met a couple of guys that were introduced to me on a previous visit, who were kind of these, shall we say, black marketeers, shall we say. So they're involved in the shadow economy. Russian speakers from Kharkiv, um, which would be the kind of typical guys that Putin would say, oh, they're definitely going to support me, right? They were the first guys on the streets of Kharkiv fighting the Russians when they invaded. I mean, we can get our heads around that because they believe they're Ukrainians, right? I mean, I grew up with Irish people who didn't speak Gaelic. I mean, they're still Irish patriots, but they could never get their heads around that because they're supposed to be compatriots, supposed to be Russian speakers, and these guys were defeated Russian troops in the suburbs of Kharkiv in the first few days of the invasion, and these were, you know. I mean, these two guys I'm referring to were actually ex-Afghansi. Uh,
Mm.
and I was on a last year when I was in Ukraine, I was in Kryvyi Rih, Zelensky's hometown, and I just happened to be there when there were a group of Afghans who were having an evening, like, well, a drunken evening, shall we say, commemorating the withdrawal of Soviet troops from, I think it was some big anniversary last year, um, 25th anniversary or whatever it was, from Afghanistan. And I was expecting these Afghans in Kryvyi Rih to be quite nostalgic for the Soviet Union, kind of pro-Russian.
Mm.
They would have been okay in a Banderivsky setting in the diaspora. Their views of the Russians were as in the same kind of mold as I grew up with in the hard right nationalist community of Great Britain. This is how things have changed,
Mhm.
and how these guys now hate Russians. In the center of Kryvyi Rih, I forget the particular person. There's a statue in the center of Kryvyi Rih, and guess which color the flag is on the statue? Black and red. In Kryvyi Rih.
Great.
Kryvyi Rih. So yeah, I mean, Putin and those guys, they didn't understand Ukraine in 2022. They still don't understand Ukraine. And I don't think, sadly, maybe with the exception of Rubio, but he has to play the game, they don't understand Ukraine in the Trump team either. I mean, so we have this problem on both sides, that there's a lack of understanding of what's driving this war.
Доки всі сплять, доки сонце іще не зійшло, гине вогонь, догоряє остання лампада, де той літак, що світанком візьме на крило і понесе, там, де небо, тепло і зорепад, доки всі сплять, доки тиша скрипить за вікном, холод весни заповзає в кімнату над ранням, де той вокзал, що покличе сигнальним гудком і проведе між одвічними вперше й востаннє, доки всі сплять, доки сон обіймає рідню в світлі вогню, де ледь чутно виходиш з кімнати, сонце встає, йде назустріч наступному дню, а літаки й паротяги чекають команди рушати.